How do I describe my characters? Well, I actually have a specific way I do it, but in this podcast episode, I'm going to be talking about 3 different ways that I think are really useful that go away from a traditional way of describing your characters, and I think it's a very powerful way to do it as well. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. How do you describe your characters? How do you go about conveying who a specific character is to your readers? Or maybe I should ask a different question. How were you taught to describe your characters? I'm going to actually make a guess, and I'm probably going to be correct in this guess because this is the way I was taught to describe my characters as well. And you can actually break this way of describing characters down into one single word: blocks. I was taught to describe characters using blocks. What I mean by that is when I wrote a description of a character, or when I was told to write a description of anything, not just characters, I was told that I should write the whole entire description in one go. Maybe I write it in one paragraph, maybe I write it in 2 paragraphs, maybe it takes an entire page to write, God forbid, but that was the way I was taught to describe characters and other things within my writing. Now, if you were taught this way, or if you are a teacher teaching this way, I don't think you need to worry, and I don't think you need to get extremely advanced depending on the age level you're teaching, because I think this is a useful way to learn how to describe things. Writing in a block can be really useful to a newer writer because that writer sees how these different pieces of a character all connect together logically. And it's much harder to see how the pieces of a character connect together when you get to a more advanced type of writing, right? It's a lot harder, by that I mean, to take all those pieces of a character and explain who that character is if you're the person writing it. It's a little different when you're the actual reader because readers experience things a little differently than writers. There's a lot of cases where you are reading something you write, you think it's terrible, but someone who is a reader and not a writer will not think the same way. So this is useful to write in this way. This is useful to describe a character, a place, an action, etc. in this way because we experience things as discrete units. So when you are a newer writer or when you're teaching writing, it can be really useful because those people who are newer writers, if you are a newer writer, you are going to see things as blocks. You are going to take all these little pieces of something you're trying to describe and you are going to see it as a whole, so it makes sense to put it all together within your writing. But I think that if you want to be a serious writer, you should move beyond this type of writing. I don't think that you never can do it. I think there are places within your writing, is what I mean, that you can use this block form of describing something, where you can have a character that you describe in a paragraph in one go. But I think that you need to adopt other ways of describing characters and different things in your writing as well. I think that you can make your writing a lot more interesting if you decide to shift away from this block form in most cases. Like I said, I don't think you need to get rid of it completely because there is a use for it. It still can be very useful. If you ever play a sport, you always go back to the fundamentals because the fundamentals create the foundation on which you build everything else. And this is kind of the fundamental way of describing things within your writing. Now it creates that basis, but I do not think we should stay there. We should move beyond it. But where do we go? And that is really the question. How should we approach descriptions? How can we convey a character to a reader in a way that makes sense, in a way that is not just sensical, but that is also interesting? Because we're not just trying to make sense to a reader, we're also trying to engage them with our writing. Of course, first comes sense. First comes the reader understanding what we're trying to say. And second comes that interest the reader has in our writing and the flow and what draws the reader in. So here are 3 ways you can approach descriptions that I think are very useful, that are different than the norm, especially if you're someone who's a newer writer. And this is something, these are different ways I write in my writing itself. So this isn't just me saying you should use it and making this up. These are actually ways I describe things or people in my books. So the first way I call is weaving the description into the story. A few episodes back, might be 12, I can't exactly remember, I have an episode called Teasing Out the Details of Your Story, or something to that effect. And that has a similar concept within that episode. In that episode, I talked about this idea that you are not telling everything about your story to the reader all at once, but you're giving them little bits and pieces. You're leaving them breadcrumbs that make the story get more and more and more intense until you reveal everything to them. And you say, hey, this is what the story is about, or hey, this is what's happening, or hey, this is the answer to the question that I'm putting in your mind. You can see this idea working really well with mystery, because with mysteries, we are explicitly putting clues in the reader's hands. And then the reader is trying to figure out how all those clues fit together. And at the end of the mystery, we're revealing what actually is happening. We're revealing the mystery, right? We're pulling the curtain back on the questions that the reader has. If you want to apply this to a character specifically, you can think of monster stories. Within monster stories, we all know that the anticipation of the monster is better. What happens in the anticipation period of the monster is that the reader is given clues about who that monster is. The monster might make a specific sound. The monster might do a specific thing. The monster might take out people's brains and put them back in, etc. There's a lot of different things that happen with monsters, and often it is the case that the monster is actually more interesting before we actually know who it is. There's very few instances within a story where the monster is more interesting at the end of the story than in the middle of the story. So how does this apply to your character exactly? Well, instead of writing blocks of text that explain your character, you can write those blocks of text, or you don't even necessarily have to write the block of text. You can take the information you know about your character and you can weave it into the story itself, right? You can put little details here and there. If the character, this is a very cliche type of thing, but if the character is running his hands through his hair, you can actually say what the color hair is. If the character, another cliche thing, is looking in a mirror, say what the color eyes are of the character. You don't actually need to explain those specific things, but these are just very easy examples to see. You can explain how the character walks as they're walking, their thought processes. You can bring in who they are as a character through their thought processes or how they talk, etc. There's a lot of different ways to do that. You can explain their backstory through their thoughts. You can explain their backstory through how someone thinks about them. You can explain their backstory through someone talking to them or yelling at them or whatever it is. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Okay, so I can't get into all the different ways, but the basic idea of this is that you are taking those things you want the reader to know about your character and you are weaving it into the story. You're placing it at specific points and you're not taking a break from the story to say this is who the character is. You're actually putting in who the character is within the story itself. The second way I do this, the second strategy I think that is very useful to you, and it might be the most useful strategy for most writers, especially if you haven't been writing a very long time. This might be something you can jump into right away. And it does connect back to the first way. Instead of writing the description of the character, when you introduce the character, describe the character in action. Instead of saying this is what the character looked like, this is what he liked to do, this is his personality, pick a specific action the character can do and describe how that character acts out that specific action. How does the character eat a bowl of cereal? Now, I'm not saying that you should use that as your example in every situation. All your characters should not be introduced eating a bowl of cereal, okay? But that's an example, right? How does your character walk? If your character is playing golf with another character, how do they swing their golf club? Are they good or bad at it? Do they get frustrated? Are they short-tempered, etc.? There's a lot of things you can reveal about a person through how they do a specific thing. You can reveal a lot of things about their mood as well in how they do a specific thing. You can reveal whether they're good at that thing. You can reveal whether they're a happy person, a sad person, whether they like to talk when they do something, whether they're a chatterbox, etc., etc., etc. So if you introduce somebody, one thing you can do is you can have, if you're trying to introduce the main character and the main character is from a first-person perspective, this becomes a little more difficult. But if you're introducing the main character from a third-person perspective, or even more powerful, if the main character is looking at someone else and watching them do something, then you're adding another layer to that description, because you're adding who that person is from that character's perspective, which might actually distort who that character is. It might actually not be a clear picture of who that character is, and that brings a lot of interest to the story. So that's another way to do it. And there are millions of different things a person can be doing that can help you show who that person is. And there's things that characters will not do, right? So if you have a character who is terrified of something, you can actually show who that character is. And you can even bring in a conflict within the story in the first moments of introducing them by showing who that character is and what they absolutely refuse to do, right? If a character is completely terrified of something, you can show that character being terrified of that thing, show how they react, show how they come down from that terror, who they are normally when they're recovering themselves, when they're talking, when they're back to their sane self, and then you can bring that thing back into the story later on and make that character deal with that specific thing. So there's a lot of different ways where you can use the person, you can use the character you build to actually show how everything works in the story. You can actually build it into the story and connect that character more to the story than you did before. The last one you might think is a cop-out, but I think it's a very useful thing to do because I think people often describe characters too much. And this strategy is just don't describe the character. Write the story, put in what you need to about the character will talk, the character will do things in the story. You don't need to actually have a physical description of the character. I think that in a lot of cases, who the character is and how they act in the world will actually show the reader who that character is, will actually be a better picture of who that character is. And then the reader can actually pull information from that character and who that character is, and they can create a physical representation or a representation of that character in their mind of what that character looks like, how they talk exactly, etc. Now, you might think this is a cop-out, but I think this can be very useful again because, first of all, you don't have to worry about who the character is when you're describing them, right? You don't have to take a break. You do not have to take a break in the story, in the narrative, to describe the character. All you have to do is you have to have an understanding of who the character is in your own mind, and then you have to try to convey who that character is as well as you can through your writing itself. So what do you think of this? Do you think these are good ways that you can actually write? If you do, you can definitely comment down below or reach out to me on social media with your ideas. Or are there other ways as well that you have of describing your character that are different than just the block form? I'd love to hear it. I definitely love to hear it because I'm always interested in different ways people are writing, and I'm always interested in ideas people have about writing that they aren't necessarily sure of, but they're trying to work their way toward a better understanding of writing. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support me, there's really one simple thing you can do. You can go to danielpoppie.com/newsletter and sign up for my newsletter. And when you sign up, you'll actually be able to get access to my publication roadmap. So that's everything I have planned for pretty much every project I have into the next decade. Again, that is danielpoppie.com/newsletter. You can also find the link below.